En este clip les tengo a Joe Rogan y Stephen Meyer presentando el caso para Dios de una manera clara y detallada. Acompáñame a ver el clip y al final dejaré mis comentarios.
The thing that really convinced me as a university student studying philosophy was an argument known as the argument from epistemological necessity. The fundamental question in modern philosophy that has really just been a stumper and has led to this whole postmodern turn where people don't think there's no objective basis for any reality is the question of the reliability of the human mind. On what basis can we trust the way our minds process all that sensory information? This goes back to Hume and Kant and some of the philosophers in the Enlightenment period. And from that point forward, there was a great doubt. Maybe we can't trust our minds. Maybe we can't trust. We have all these things we assume about reality in order to make sense about reality. That every cause has an effect, for example. But we can't prove those things. We have to use those assumptions in order to know anything at all. And I encountered this argument that suggested, well, if we try to justify our ability to know the world around us by empirical data, by things we observe, this was Hume's argument. You can't do it. He was a radical empiricist and found that in order to make any sense of the sense impressions he had to presuppose the uniformity of nature. But to prove the uniformity of nature, he had to make reference to sensory observations, and so he was arguing in a circle. And so it came down, you couldn't justify the reliability of assumptions we make in our minds by observing the world. You had to use those assumptions to make sense of the observations. But if you presupposed that our minds were made by a benevolent creator who gave us those assumptions in order to make sense of the world that he also made, then there was a principle of correspondence between the way the mind worked and the way the world worked, in which case we could trust the basic reliability of the mind. And this turns out to be one of the key foundational assumptions that gave rise to modern science. It was called the idea of intelligibility. Newton, Boyle, Kepler, the great founders of modern science, thought that nature had secrets to reveal. There were patterns there to be revealed that we could understand because our minds had been made in the image of the same rational creator who had built rationality and design and pattern and lawful order into the world.
Bueno, en primer lugar, debemos aplaudir la forma en la que Stephen Meyer presenta claramente su argumento a Joe Rogan. Yo creo que esta es una de las cosas más importantes de un filósofo. No solamente usar la terminología propia de la disciplina, pero sino tener la habilidad de explicarlo claramente hacia la persona que claramente aquí Joe Rogan no tiene ningún trasfondo filosófico. Y lo segundo que menciona Stephen Meyer en relación al origen de la ciencia moderna es sumamente importante, ya que si nosotros repasamos la historia, una de las claves, y esto lo menciona John Lennox, el motor que impulsó el origen de la ciencia moderna y todas estas mentes, Newton, Faraday, Kepler, Maxwell, etc., fue la idea de un creador, de un legislador, de un ser inteligente detrás del universo, de la creación como tal, y que por lo tanto esto generaba en ellos un interés natural de descubrir o al menos conocer las maneras o los mecanismos por los cuales tal ser, Dios en este caso, había creado el universo. Y mediante esta curiosidad ellos comenzaron a explorar, a probar, y mediante este principio se originó el descubrimiento de las leyes naturales que son la base de la ciencia moderna. Por esta razón, cuando nosotros vemos al pasado, vemos que las grandes mentes que dieron origen a todos estos principios eran creyentes, eran teístas, y su mayoría de ellos eran cristianos.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in, I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor. I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell. And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today. I attended a conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society in London, Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks. And many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution. The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist. And he simply enumerated the five major, what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms. It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms. Think about, for example, Darwin's finch beaks. Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place. So modification, yes. Innovation, no.
But modification over massive amounts of time, don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
Well, time,
like primates.
Time was always the hero of the plot. But let me just run a couple of arguments by you, and let's see what you think. Okay, and I developed these in a lot of detail in my book Darwin's Doubt. If we now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new code, because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types, new types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. So we have these long digital bit strings of A's, C's, G's, and T's, not zeros and ones, but A's, C's, G's, and T's in a digital string, and we call that a gene. And if you have a section of DNA for building a protein, that's great, all works. Now, but if you want to build a fundamentally new form of life, you got to have new proteins to service the new cell types to build the new anatomical structures. In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system. That the functional sequences they're highly isolated in what's called sequence space. You can change a few things and still retain function, but after a very few number of changes, you're going to degrade the function, and long before you come up with a new function. Now, the Darwinian mechanism starts with the idea that there are random changes in those digital bit strings, those sequences of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And based on our experience in the computer world, we would expect that random changes are going to, again, degrade those strings long before they're capable of building a new protein.
Y bueno, da un poco de risa porque en estos minutos Stephen Meyer está bombardeando a Joe Rogan con diferentes conceptos y lo hace de una manera muy buena. Empieza por detallar el tema de la evolución. Uno de los problemas en la cultura popular es que se tiene una concepción muy generalizada sobre el tema de la evolución. Y aquí Stephen Meyer le dice claramente a Joe Rogan, hay ciertos aspectos de la teoría evolutiva, específicamente las descripciones de Darwin en torno a las variaciones de diferentes especies que son influenciadas por cambios climáticos, por cambios en la naturaleza, que claramente están documentados y con eso no hay ningún problema. Pero lo que presenta Meyer aquí es otra cuestión muy importante y es que no se tiene evidencia de que una especie como tal puede originar hacia otro tipo de especie. En otras palabras, un tipo de línea celular no puede generar otro tipo de línea celular nueva o distinta, ya que eso requiere información, y la información como tal no se produce al azar o de la nada, porque para ello necesitas código. Y la siguiente pregunta aquí es de dónde se origina tal código. ¿Qué es lo que posteriormente pasa a explicarle? Probablemente fue el tema más importante debatido en la academia. Incluso James Tour tuvo un debate con Lee Cronin en Harvard. Ese debate me tomó semanas traducirlo y fue muy importante. Confrontó a la comunidad académica. Y estamos hablando de la élite de la ciencia al decirles, no tenemos evidencia que justifique que se enseñe la teoría de la evolución como un hecho científico demostrable. Porque no hay evidencia de tal. Y lo que hizo James Tour simplemente fue decirles, vamos a ser honestos en la academia, no tenemos idea de dónde se origina la información. Algo que desde luego hizo enojar a la academia. Porque si tú le dices a la comunidad que no tienes idea del origen de la vida, del origen de la información como tal, de la primer célula, abres una puerta gigante para que entre el teísmo. Y precisamente es la puerta que no se desea abrir en nuestra sociedad. Pero si somos rigurosos, la puerta está abierta. Y es válido aceptar y decir, no sabemos de dónde es el origen. Por supuesto, como teísta y como cristiano tenemos un caso para presentar eso. Pero desafortunadamente allá afuera se mantiene cerrando esta puerta. Y lo peor aún, con un grado de ignorancia, se promueve la evolución como un estandarte absoluto de la verdad y como una refutación clara hacia el teísmo o la idea de Dios. ¿Qué opinas? Los invito a que se suscriban, a que dejen sus comentarios y nos vemos en el siguiente clip.